If we don't build that place, I'm gonna freak out and say, I gave over 1,500 of shipment out.
started, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our GenX exposure study PFAS results from the Fayetteville area blood sample 29. Our panelists for this evening are Dr. Nadine Collard. She is the postdoctoral researcher who has worked on testing for PFAS in the water and blood samples collected in the GenX exposure study. And Dr. Jane Hoppen. She is a professor at NC State and the principal investigator of the GenX exposure study. She will be able to answer questions afterward about the study's next steps and future directions. If you have any questions that arise during the presentation, we do have some index cards on the table at the doorway and some pens. Please feel free to go over and pick one up and write your questions down, and I will go around and collect those during the presentation. Please write one question per card so that we can properly submit your questions to get with sufficient answers. So if you have a index card that you would have raise your hand, I'll come by and get those. So we will have a Q&A period after the presentation from Dr. Collard. No further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Collard, and she can tell you about the results from the blood sample study.
Can everyone hear me okay in the back? I think I'll just speak loudly and instead of using the microphone. And can everyone hear me on Zoom? Claire, give us a sign.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I want to say thank you very much for being here this evening, for joining us for this meeting. My name is Nadine Collard. I'm a postdoctoral researcher on the study, and I'm going to be presenting the initial results of the blood samples that we collected in February 2019 in the Fayetteville area. Okay, one second. Can you hear me better? Yeah. How about now?
Yeah. Let's try this one.
No, somebody unplugged.
Okay. Reading on channel 5.
Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me? Testing. How about now? Can you hear me? That's better. Is that better? Okay, thank you for letting us know. So my name is Nadine Collard. I'm a postdoc on this study, and we'll be presenting the results of the blood samples that we collected in February of 2019 in the Fayetteville area. Putting some feedback here. Okay, remember that PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and this is a large family of human-made chemicals that are used to make a variety of consumer products. If we keep having problems, I'll try to speak extra loud. So they're used to make a variety of consumer products, and they can be released to the environment by facilities that make or use PFAS. This is an aerial image of the Fayetteville Works chemical manufacturing site. It sits on the banks of the Cape Fear River it draws in water from the Cape Fear River to use in its processes. The water is treated at a wastewater treatment plant on site, and then the wastewater was discharged back to the Cape Fear River. Better? Okay. So wastewater from the Fayetteville Works facility was discharged back to the Cape Fear River. And it was through those wastewater discharges that PFAS from the facility were brought into the Cape Fear River. And then a second and another important way that PFAS have been released from the facility is through air emissions. And these PFAS include GenX, but are not just GenX. And so PFAS are emitted into the air from the facility. They deposit onto the ground. They can leach into the groundwater, and then contaminate the wells. Our study is called the GenX Exposure Study. This is a research study funded by the National Institutes of Health. We started this work in November of 2017 in Wilmington, North Carolina, and then in February of 2019, we expanded the study to include participants in the Fayetteville area. And our study is really a community engaged study. We aim to answer questions posed by community members. And so 3 questions that our community members have asked are, is GenX detectable in my body? What predicts GenX in my body? And are there health effects associated with GenX? And even though this is called the GenX Exposure Study, this study is about much more than just GenX. We're interested in several PFAS, many PFAS that are associated with Fayetteville Works, so not just GenX, but other PFAS called Naphthalene byproduct 2, one called PFO5-DOA, and several others. We're also interested in testing for what are called legacy PFAS, and these are PFAS that have been used historically throughout the Cape Fear River Basin and in the United States. And there are several possible sources of these legacy PFAS. And so some notable examples of these legacy PFAS are PFOA and PFOS. And so really our goal of our study is to get a comprehensive picture of PFAS exposure, which includes those PFAS that we know to be from Fayetteville Works, but also includes PFAS that are important contaminants throughout the United States. So our study in February of 2019 was expanded in the Fayetteville area, and we recruited people who had homes served by private wells and who had wells tested for GenX by December of 2018. And we used those GenX results to aim to have half of our participants in the Fayetteville area with wells that had levels of GenX above 140 nanograms per liter. 140 nanograms per liter is the provisional health goal for GenX in water. And then we aimed to have half of our participants with levels in their wells below 140 nanograms per liter. And the reason for this is an exposure study, and so we are looking to have a wide range of exposures represented in our participants in this study. Ultimately, we enrolled 153 people ranging in ages from 9 to 85 years in February of 2019. So this is just a map of the area highlighting the Cape Fear River and the Fayetteville Works facility. And in this red oval, this is where the homes of our participants fall. And you can see that The majority of them are in Cumberland County, specifically to the northeast of the facility. And so looking at this oval, you can see that we're not just focusing on participants that live downriver of the facility, we're focusing on participants that live in the surrounding areas because of the importance of air emissions for the PFAS releases in this area. So we sampled 84 wells of our participants' homes as part of the study. And if you're a participant in our study, you should have received your wells results in May of 2020. We also presented the results publicly in June of 2020. And I just wanted to remind everyone what we found in those well samples. We found a wide range of GenX concentrations across the wells, from some wells that we could not find GenX in. They were non-detect, to wells that had roughly 900 nanograms per liter or parts per trillion GenX. We also found 10 other PFAS frequently in the wells, and 8 of those 10 PFAS are from the Fayetteville Works facility. The PFAS that was at highest concentration was called PMPA. And the median level of that PFAS was 350 nanograms per liter, which means that half of the samples in the wells, half of the well samples were above 350 nanograms per liter, half of the well samples had PMPA below 350 nanograms per liter. And so what this really illustrated or showed us is that there was a very strong Fayetteville Works PFAS signature in the well samples. We did detect some legacy PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, in some of the wells. And so up to this point, I think we've just been wanting to set the stage for what we really want to talk about this evening, which is what we found in the blood samples that we collected in February of 2019. And so I'm going to start by telling you the key findings from the blood samples, and then we'll talk about what we did and walk through each of those results in a little bit more detail. We found 3 PFAS from the Fayetteville Works facility in more than 10% of the blood samples, and those PFAS were Nathion byproduct 2, PFO5 DOA, and PEPA. We did not find GenX, PMPA, or Hydroweave in the blood samples. We found 5 legacy PFAS in almost all participants' blood samples. Those were PFHXS, PFHPS, PFOA, PFOS, and PFNA. And when we compared the levels of those legacy PFAS in the Fayetteville area with public data for the US population, we found that the legacy levels in the Fayetteville area are higher than the average levels for people living in the United States. So let's back up and talk a little bit about what we did. We analyzed these blood samples, or we tested these blood samples for 26 different PFAS. And each participant provided 1 blood sample, so there were 153 blood samples in this testing. The testing was done at the US EPA facility in Research Triangle Park by doctors Mark Striner, James McCord, and Teresa Gillette. And we chose these 26 PFAS based on what we knew about the Fayetteville Works facility and the PFAS that were being released from that facility. And we also chose these PFAS based on what we knew were commonly detected in people across the US, so those legacy PFAS. Here's just a list of those 26 PFAS that we analyzed for, the 10 PFAS that are uniquely associated with the Fayetteville Works facility, including GenX, but several others, and then 16 PFAS that are considered legacy PFAS. Some of these may have been released to the environment by Fayetteville Works, but there may also be other sources of these PFAS to the environment. So they're not uniquely associated with Fayetteville Works. So what I'm showing you here is a chart that shows detection frequency, or how frequently chemical was detected across the 153 samples. And so for this top chemical, PFHXS, the bar goes all the way out to 100%. And so that shows that we detected PFHXS in 100% of the samples. So in all 153 blood samples that we collected. And you can see that there is a wide range of detection frequencies. Some chemicals detected relatively infrequently, some chemicals detected in almost all of the samples. There are 3 PFAS here detected in more than 10% of the samples that are associated with the Fayetteville Works facility, and those are Naphthalene byproduct 2, PFO5DA, and PEPA. We detected Naphthalene byproduct 2 in about 60% of the 153 samples, PFO5DOA in about 40%, and PEPA in about 20%. We did not detect GenX in the blood samples, and this is consistent with what the Department of Health and Human Services found in their investigation in 2018. They also did not find GenX in blood samples from 30 people living near the Fayetteville Works facility. And this also is consistent with the idea that GenX leaves the body quickly, and so recent reports have suggested a very short half-life for GenX, between 3 and 4 days, where it goes away from the body quickly, and so this could be one of the reasons why we did not detect GenX in the blood samples collected in our study. We also did not find PMPA or Hydroweave in the blood samples. And just to remind you, we did see, of course, we had GenX. GenX was present in the wells that we sampled at the same time that we collected blood. PMPA was present in the wells, in more than half of the wells that we sampled. And Hydroweave was present in about 20% of the wells that we sampled in February of 2019. So although they were present in the well water, we did not detect these compounds in the blood samples. So we've talked about those compounds that are, those chemicals that are specific to Fayetteville Works. Let's talk now about the legacy PFAS, or those PFAS that are present throughout the United States. And so these top 5 are legacy PFAS, and we found these legacy PFAS in almost all of the participant samples. And so focusing in a little bit more on PFHXS, this figure shows you a circle for every sample in the study. So there's 153 circles here. And it's showing you the spread of the data. So each person is represented by a circle on this chart. And the yellow square is showing you the median level of PFHXS in the blood samples, around 3 nanograms per mil. We wanted to know how the levels of legacy PFAS in the Fayetteville area compared with people living in the United States generally. And we didn't then go and sample people in the rest of the United States. What we did is rely on publicly available data. And so the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It's called NHANES. This is a biannual survey where they collect blood samples from people in the United States, and they analyze those samples for a wide range of chemicals, including some PFAS. And so some of the PFAS that they analyzed for are the same PFAS that we analyzed the Fayetteville blood samples for, and so we can make comparisons. And so we looked at the data that CDC made available for 1,929 people from 2017 to 2018 and compared the Fayetteville results with these results from CDC. So in this figure, I'm showing the median level of PFH excess in the Fayetteville blood samples collected in our study and the median level of PFH excess in the US population based on that NHANES data. And you can see that the median level in Fayetteville is higher than the median level for the US population. Is this also the case for the other legacy PFAS we looked for? And the answer is yes. So comparing the Fayetteville median to the US population median for these other legacy PFAS, you can see that the median levels in Fayetteville are higher than the US population levels for 2017, 2018, which really represents people living in the US recently. So in summation, or in the summary of the results are that we found 3 PFAS from Fayetteville Works in more than 10% of the samples. Those PFAS were Nafion byproduct 2, PFO5-DOA, and PEPA. We did not find GenX, PMPA, or Hydroweave in the blood samples. We found 5 legacy PFAS in almost all of the participants' blood samples. Those were PFHXS, PFHPS, PFOA, PFOS, and PFNA. And the levels of those legacy PFAS in the Fayetteville area are elevated relative to the US population. I want to take a minute and talk a little bit about what these results can and cannot tell us. And so for participants in our study, what these results can tell you is how much PFAS was present in blood when the sample was collected, but it cannot tell us how the levels of PFAS may change over time. Because remember, we collected a single blood sample from each participant at one point in time. It also cannot tell us what exposure led to the presence of each of these PFAS in blood. These results give us an idea of the range of blood levels in the 153 people who provided samples in February of 2019. It cannot tell us the full range of PFAS levels across all people who have been impacted by the Fayetteville Works discharges. We've learned since February 2019, many more people have been impacted or had wells that have been identified to be contaminated. And so really our data represents those 153 people, not the full extent of people who have been impacted. These results also cannot tell us if a current health problem is related to PFAS levels in blood, or if negative health effects will come in the future for an individual. And part of the reason why we don't know whether these blood levels will result in a certain health effect in the future for an individual is there are no health advisory levels for PFAS in blood. So unlike water, where we have a provisional health goal of 140 nanograms per liter for GenX, we don't have a health advisory level for these PFAS in blood. So there are a few other things that we want to remind you about these blood measurements. Why did we collect blood from the beginning? And so blood is really the gold standard for understanding exposure. So remember, this is an exposure study. And so higher blood levels would be suggestive of a higher PFAS exposure. And there is much blood data, for example, through CDC's NHANES program that we're able to use for comparison. What are the units? And so there have been questions in the past about nanograms per milliliter, parts per trillion, parts per billion. So I wanted to just clarify this. Blood levels are generally reported in nanograms per milliliter or parts per billion. Water levels are reported in nanograms per liter or parts per trillion. Exposure to parts per trillion levels in water can result in parts per billion levels in blood, so much higher levels in blood, because these compounds are very bioaccumulative, so they can accumulate in blood. And so we detect them at much higher concentrations in blood. And so that's why when we talk about blood, we're talking about parts per billion. When we talk about water, you often see those data reported in parts per trillion. But what if we didn't find a PFAS in blood? For example, we did not find GenX in the blood samples. Some PFAS may not be found in blood, even though we know an exposure happened. We know that GenX was present in the water and that people drank the water. Just because we didn't see it in blood doesn't mean that there wasn't an exposure, and it doesn't mean that there aren't necessarily health effects. It does mean we need to find another way to estimate exposure. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Hoppen to talk about what we're doing next with this study.
So I'll let Nadine run the slides. So what we're doing next. So in February 2020, really good time to start something new. North Carolina State University received a Superfund Center grant, and so this includes 4 projects to understand PFAS. One project is the expansion of the GenX exposure study. Dr. Knappe, who's on the phone, has a study to look at various ways of remediating PFAS. There are studies by Dr. Belcher and others looking at how chemicals in the environment impact animals and livestock, and other people like Dr. Jamie DeWitt who are looking at toxicological impacts of these chemicals. So under the center, we have those 4 projects going on, as well as having a community engagement core and a training core for students. So we have a lot more resources to help address this question. Oh, the slides have locked. So what's going to happen on the next slide at some point is going to say that we're lucky because now we have the ability to expand the GenX exposure study. So initially we had 344 people in Wilmington, and now there's another data on 153 people in Fayetteville. And now what we're doing is building out the study so we can have over 1,000 people throughout the Cape Fear Basin. So people from Leland and Wilmington and the lower Cape Fear, people from Fayetteville and people from Pittsburgh. And we're going to follow people over time for at least 5 years and maybe up to 20 so that we can really understand the potential health effects of chemicals. And we're going to focus on not only understanding how PFAS move through your body, but also how these chemicals impact your thyroid, cholesterol, other aspects of metabolism, and see how these chemicals may influence both your response to COVID as well as the response to vaccines. So those are part of our research questions. And throughout this, our goal is to share results with you in meetings like this and hopefully more meetings in person so we can really answer questions and use your questions to help form the research that we're doing. So the next steps, so what are we going to do in the next year as we recover from our pandemic times? We're going to answer these questions. Like, we today can't say who people at higher well water have higher levels in their body, but we're going to focus on those questions in the next year. How do PFAS influence thyroid disease and cholesterol? And how long do these remain in your body? How do these, will some of these chemicals that were not present in everybody in 2019, what will it look like in 2021 or 2023? So we'll be able to look at how these chemicals remain in your body and help to reconstruct exposure over time. And we're planning to share results with you in meetings like this. And I think you can go. Well, if not, I think the next slide is questions. So, and before that, before we start questions, Katie May, who runs the Community Engagement Core for the Superfund Center, I'll just give you this one because I know it works.
Hi, thanks for coming. My name is Katie May. I also work at NC State, but I am not one of the scientists that took your blood or your water samples. I'm actually really interested in science communication and how you all understand and think about issues like PFAS exposure. So if you could do me a huge favor, I'm going to hand out this really short little survey. It'll take you like a minute to fill out at the end, and you can just hand it to me on your way out. And then for all the folks online, I'll send you a link and you can fill it out on the end online too. And it'll help us to get better at how we talk about these issues to people like you who are impacted by it and who it's really important to. Again, we handed out those index cards and we have plenty for you. Write one question on each one and then we'll collect them and these lovely experts can answer them for you. Thanks.
Hey, Janelle's got a mic. So. Yeah,
We're coming.
Let's take a couple minutes break to get
Think of any as we go along. Something like the just straight up like this, like this from you.
I'm doing a chat question. For the Q&A. Look at Q&A.
Okay, the first question comes from Dana. Did you test for the same 26 PFAS in water that you tested for in the blood?
Can you hear me?
No. Right now.
So the answer, the question is for the virtual, if you didn't hear this. Did we test for the same 26 PFAS in water that we tested for in blood? And the answer is, for the most part, yes. There are some PFAS that we tested for in blood that were added to our list that we did not look for in water. But for the most part, the majority of compounds overlap. The majority of chemicals overlap between the water and the blood analysis.
And one of the things that we're going to do in the future is that we now have the technology at NC State to measure total organic fluorine. So we can then expand our list of 26 chemicals to all sorts of precursors that may create and be related to PFAS.
And she also wanted to give a comment. A PFMOAA was not included as the highest concentration from the Chemours facility.
So the question is, why haven't you analyzed for PFMOAA in, I assume, the blood samples, right? Because we have analyzed for PFMOAA in the water samples. And PFMOAA is this shorter chain PFAS associated with Fayetteville Works, and yes, it was present at very high levels in the Cape Fear River. And so analytically, PFMOAA has been a challenge for us, getting that compound, measuring that compound with all of the other compounds has been challenging, and so we still have the blood samples. We're still interested in analyzing them for PFMOAA. But we decided to move forward with the analysis for the other 26 chemicals that I mentioned because it's just been challenging to really nail that compound down.
And she also wanted to know if the expanded study that includes an examination of health effects going to consider effects of PFAS mixtures.
So yeah, so we know that no one in this room, whether you live in Fayetteville or not, is exposed to one PFAS. So what we are trying to do is evaluate these chemicals both individually, but all together as a mixture so that we can really try to understand whether the sum of the parts is worse than each one individually. So that's definitely a part of our research going forward.
Are the 26 chemicals able to be tested in fecal samples?
It's possible. I don't really know about PFAS analysis in fecal samples or whether that would be a good measure of exposure. So I'm going to have to punt on that question. And if you wanted to email our study, we could look in the literature and try to get back to you on that.
But it's hard to get people to donate them. So we try to focus on things that people are willing to part with, many people. So.
Will you be able to get a numerical value for the compounds that the residents tested positive for?
So in our report back, we did the same thing that we did in Wilmington, was just to present the range with the scale. So we haven't reported individual values to anyone. And partly it's because these chemicals are measured with error. And since there was no numeric value to compare them to, like there is a health advisory for water, we chose not to share the individual values at this time.
Are there other studies that may have more information gathered from blood samples?
Other studies, wait, whose question is this?
That was a question from the chat online.
So maybe people can ask us like other studies in North Carolina, in the United States, so maybe go on and maybe we're going to answer what more of that.
We also have a question, when will we learn the results from June 2021?
So the good news is that North Carolina State now has a state-of-the-art mass spectrometer, and we also have analytic standards for many of the chemours-related chemicals. So we will be able, we just got an estimate that's going to take 6 months to run our samples once we get started. So I'm hoping that by next April or May, we should be having that conversation with you and be able to provide better information on a lot of the chemours related chemicals that we in the past have had to rely on analytic standards from the company.
Why isn't there a recommended level of PFAS as a baseline?
So there are very few chemicals that we have health advisory levels for in blood. And one of the questions you would think, one of the things that we know the most about is lead. And when they first set a health advisory for lead, it was 50 micrograms per deciliter. And it's dropped all the way to 5 micrograms per deciliter, and we still know that there are health effects in children. And it took over 100 years to generate that data. So right now, there's just not enough literature on PFAS to help make those recommendations. I will also let you know that I'm part of a National Academies of Science and Medicine and Engineering that's focused on answering this question about testing people for PFAS and providing what kind of healthcare should PFAS exposed individuals get. And so we're hoping to have the report out next May. So maybe there will be some advisory level, but as you know, the levels are coming down. So where is, like the level you are today probably was higher in the past. So we want to be sure that we don't ignore the past by focusing on the level today.
To go back to the question regarding the other studies with other information about blood samples, she wants to know if there are any studies anywhere in the country that may provide that information.
Okay, so right now, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is part of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, is funding a multi-site study that has 7 different PFAS exposed communities throughout the United States. And they, I think, are enrolling about 6,000 people across these sites, and children and adults, to help answer questions about legacy PFAS in the United States. So there's more data out there. There's no other studies in the US about the fluoroethers and the chemours related chemicals, because unfortunately for you, there's not other communities that have had this exposure that we can learn from.
Are any of the people in the study tested from the chemo facility? Do they work at the chemo facility, or are they firefighters in the area?
So I've been asked to repeat the question.
Just closer to the mic so that the virtual audience.
Oh, I see, okay. So, so it's my responsibility as the principal investigator not to tell who's in the study. So the question is, are there people who work at chemours or firefighters enrolled in the study? And I will let you know that the answer to both of those is true. And we have a whole questionnaire that we ask people about activities that we believe could be related to other sources of PFAS exposure. But I don't know how many of people who work at chemours or people who are firefighters are in the study, but we do ask about those questions in our questionnaire.
Yeah, this set of questions pertains to the health effects of PFAS. This one wants to know what are some of the known health effects. The comment is, I have itchy skin, low energy, and I'm tired all the time. Could this be related?
So the question is, what are the health effects of PFAS? And some of the health effects sound like pandemic malaise at this point. But what we do know, so in almost every population where they've looked at PFAS exposure, we see that people who have higher levels of PFAS also have higher cholesterol. So that's been a concern for a long time. These studies have not shown higher levels of strokes and heart attacks. And so what we don't know is whether they haven't studied people far enough forward to see that, or if maybe there's something going on with the biology. One of the most sensitive health effects is the impact of PFAS on the immune system. So, and we're concerned about that during the time of COVID, because how the PFAS may mean that your body may not mount as strong a response if you get infected with COVID. And so we're worried about people, if you have high PFAS, whether if you get COVID, you might get sicker. There's a study from the Netherlands where they saw that people who had more severe COVID had higher levels of PFAS in their blood. So that's also a concern. There are some rare, there's a rare autoimmune disease called ulcerative colitis that was related to PFOA at the DuPont facility in Parkersburg, West Virginia. And there's a lot of concern about thyroid disease, which is why we're focusing on that in the study. And pregnancy-induced hypertension is a concern. And a few cancers, particularly testicular and kidney cancer, are of concern. But overall, PFAS can impact a lot of important body systems, like your immune system, like your thyroid system. And so we don't know all the ways that these chemicals could alter how your body responds to exposure.
And this one says, what are the effects on the human body of bathing in water contaminated with GenX and PFAS?
So the question is, what are the impacts of bathing in water containing PFAS? And I can say in general, we don't know. Mostly the advice has been from CDC that the concern is consuming water, drinking water, not bathing or showering. And I think as the science progresses, people are more interested in understanding the impacts of PFAS potentially through showering and other sources. But right now, I don't have any answers for you, but that is an active area of research.
How does PFAS level affect the purpose of vaccines?
So, how do PFAS levels affect the purpose of vaccines? So vaccines, the purpose of vaccines is to help your body develop antibodies so when it sees the infectious agent, whether it be COVID or SARS-CoV-2 or the measles, that your body is already primed to attack it. And so what we think that PFAS can influence the body's ability, maybe dampen down its ability to reduce its ability to make antibodies. So I wouldn't suggest that anybody not get vaccinated, because getting vaccinated, the risk of COVID, and if you have high levels of PFAS, is far greater than having a smaller response to a vaccine, because you can always get a second vaccine, but you don't want to get COVID the first time. So we're actively looking to see whether we're looking at people's titer to your antibody level to vaccines so that we can see whether that is associated with PFAS level.
Have you considered doing a study of people with illnesses that these chemicals cause to compare to the general study?
So, the type of study design that is suggested is a study design called a case control study. And that's where you would enroll people who have the disease and people who don't have the disease and make comparisons. And so in some ways we can do that now because some people have diseases and some people don't. But it's not a useful way sometimes if we want to follow people forward, because we'd really like to understand how these chemicals impact health going forward. And if you study people with the disease, the comparisons between people with and without the disease can be challenged because people with diseases may remember things differently. So what we're trying to do is do that study among people who have illnesses in our cohort, comparing them to people who don't and see whether they have higher levels. So we are trying to build that into what we're doing now. For some rare diseases, like cancers, we can't do that well. We're trying to figure out other ways to make that happen. But we really need people to be in the study because that helps us to answer these questions going forward.
Yeah, this is more of a comment, but something that you could probably speak to. This tissue, skin, and adipose tissue testing, sputum and deep lung wash testing. Maybe it could show inhalation and absorption levels.
These would be difficult samples.
So, so the question is related to, are there biological media that we could sample? Could we sample tissues, skin and adipose tissue, sputum levels, or deep lung wash testing? And maybe we could use that to show inhalation and absorption of PFAS. So most of those things, so the study that we've designed is regarded as a minimal exposure, minimal risk study. And so if we started getting lung washing samples, we would definitely be out of the minimal risk world. So there may be other ways, though, to think about inhalation, like measuring air levels in people's homes. Looking at, and we have the data to look at this as well, is looking at people who have contaminated well water, but their tap water is clean, but they're still showering in the water from their well. And so we may be able to look at that in some ways without trying to take these other types of samples that may be difficult to collect.
Yeah. People have different metallation cycles, faster/slower, based on genetic variants like MTFHR mutations. Can you compare the levels in those variants?
So the question has to do with the ability to methylate chemicals based on genetic variants like MTFR, MTFHR. Can you compare levels in those with variants? So at this point, we can't do that because we have not, while we have blood saved that we could extract DNA, we haven't really focused on DNA as the primary outcomes in the study. But because we're creating a repository, these are questions that we may be able to answer in the future. But we want to start with the main things first and then start to look at these kinds of differences.
Do the chemicals promote arthritis?
I don't know. There is some association with some autoimmune diseases. So some types of arthritis, like rheumatoid arthritis, may be associated. But we need studies like this so we can have better information to understand that.
This question goes back to the cholesterol. She says, my cholesterol is 86 for HDL, but the LDL is also in the 80s. Does the LDL being high present a problem?
Ooh, I am not a clinician. So I am going to suggest that asking about your cholesterol levels should go to a healthcare provider. So I think that's the better solution than having me tell you. Wait, Nadine had something.
No, I don't have that.
Okay. Yeah.
When considering these 6,000 people across the U.S. with PFAS legacy studies, is the rate of cancer higher than the general population?
So that study just started this year, so they haven't identified cancers at this point. Are you done playing Twister there?
That seems to be all the health-related questions at the moment. So there are a couple questions about the pet and plant studies. The pet studies provided numerical values. We need these values in human blood too. How can you chart with accuracy without numerical values?
So the PET study, so everything we report back has to go through our human subjects review board. And because we chose not to provide individual level data at this point in time. And we may change that rule, that decision based on conversations with our IRB and other conversations. The PET study reported a lot of one value, only one in the population values, and we chose not to do that. So we're doing things slightly differently, and so that was the choice that we made. And we may be able to change this decision, but right now this is what we have done.
Elaborate on what the IRB is.
Okay, so the IRB is our Human Subject Review Board, which means that everything that we share with study participants individually has to be approved by them and evaluate the risk of how it will impact your health, how it will impact the university's health. And so we have to send everything through the IRB beforehand. And also we want to share what we know when we know it, but we're measuring things at very low concentrations. And so while we're comfortable with where you are in the distribution, an absolute value has just more variability in it. We're not a CLIA certified lab. This is our clinical certified laboratories. And I think that's what our Human Subject Review Board would want if we were going to report individual values back to you. So I think that's why we're sitting where we are at this point.
Are homegrown vegetables safe to eat if they're grown in the affected area?
I don't know. I do know some work that Owen Duckworth has done at NC State has shown that if you increase the amount of compost in your garden, the uptake of PFAS by the plants is a lot lower. So, and I'm sure more work will come out of his lab, but I don't know whether, I can't tell you what's safe at this point.
The next set of questions is regarding the water itself. Were the PFAS released by the Fayetteville Works part of the water purification process for drinking water provided to the citizens of Fayetteville, or were they already in the river due to Chemours DuPont upstream of Fayetteville?
Oh, you could see a Detlef on?
Can you hear me okay?
Hold on, you're going to put you to the speaker.
Did you hear the question, Detlef?
So I think, are there PFAS in the river upstream from the Chemours facility at the Fayetteville Works?
Hey, hold on, Detlef. We're trying to figure out how to, we may have to repeat.
Yes, go ahead and say your response and then we'll try to repeat it for the audience here.
Okay, so PFAS are detected in almost the entire Cape Fear River watershed, starting as early as in the Greensboro area and then down into Pittsboro and further downstream towards Fayetteville.
Okay, one second.
And then
One
the
second,
Fayetteville Works
repeat.
facility.
Let me just repeat what you said. So Dr. Knappe is answering the question virtually, and I'm going to repeat what he said. So PFAS have been detected in nearly all of the Cape Fear River Basin, starting from Greensboro all the way down to Wilmington, correct? Okay, go ahead, Detlef.
So the sources that are upstream of the Fayetteville Works facility are manifold. They include, firefighting foam contribution from the Greensboro Airport. They include industrial wastewater discharges from several wastewater treatment plants upstream of the Fayetteville Works. Also, land application of some heavily impacted biosolids from Burlington are contributing.
There are several potential sources of PFAS upstream of the Fayetteville Works facility, and those include firefighting practices or foam from firefighting facilities, industrial wastewater discharge from wastewater treatment plants, and then also biosolids applications. These have all been associated with PFAS releases and are upstream of the Fayetteville Works facility.
It's also important to think about some of the PFAS sources other than the compounds that are uniquely associated with Chemours in the private wells. You know, there may be contributions from firefighting foam in, that was locally used.
It's important to think about the PFAS sources that are not associated with Fayetteville Works, and so this could include firefighting foam, for example, which could be releasing PFAS to the environment.
See, did I get the question?
I'm a little confused about the water purification bit. Okay, if this question wasn't properly answered, please go ahead and reframe and ask us again. if we misunderstood. Thank you, Detlef.
Should we continue drinking tap water?
What's echoey here? I think, so I think that if you have PFAS in your tap water, you should get a filter of some sort. And if you do have any of the PFAS detected in your well, you will be eligible for at least reverse osmosis in your household. So I think that there's no reason to drink water straight from the tap because there are options to provide safe drinking water
In this area.
If these are questions regarding the study results, what would GenX be labeled on the well water results?
Labeled as in how frequently we detected it.
So in the well water results, it should be labeled as GenX. We've been consistently calling it GenX.
So, yeah, so GenX was the third most frequently detected. GenX was the third most frequently detected in drinking
concentration.
Oh, right.
So we had a median concentration across the wells of 103 nanograms per liter. So half of the wells had more than that, half of the wells had less than that. I'm not sure I totally understand the question if they want to reframe.
Yeah, if you have any more information that you want from that question, you can always type that back into the Q&A box and we can elaborate on that question. Has Keymore seen the results of the study or have they responded to the results of the study?
So to date, we always share the results with you first, and we make it public. So all of our results are on our website, the genxstudy.ncsu.edu, and copies of our presentation will be up there tomorrow. So everybody has access to this. We have not spoken to anybody from Keymores about the study, but that's not actually what we're doing. We're generating science to help you communicate with your representatives and state and local health officials. We also talk to state and local health officials about what we're finding, and that seems to me more helpful to help you guys advocate. But we don't have any direct conversation about this with Keymore, or have not.
Yeah, these are questions about the findings in terms of publication. Have you published or do you plan to publish your findings in a journal article?
So yes, we plan to publish everything we can in journal articles because we're scientists. So, but we kind of flipped our process on the head because we want to share results with you first. So we shared the blood results with Wilmington in November of 2018, and the paper with the Wilmington results was just published in June of 2020. A copy of that you can find on our website. But our goals are to publish everything that we can, and so that it's available when people are reviewing the literature, trying to know what's out there. So that's our goal, and we are getting started with writing a lot of papers.
And the final question, how does one go about becoming part of your study group? If we have positive well values, how can we contact you to offer blood samples and be a part of the study?
So we completed our enrollment in the Wilmington area, the Wilmington area too, but in the Fayetteville area, we finished our recruitment in July of 2021. We recruited people from the list of tested wells. We contacted everybody that we could, and we scheduled 300 people 2 weekends in a row, and 40% of those people showed up, and they are in the study. And so at this point, we'll see in the future whether we have opportunities to enroll more people, but that's our goal, is to at least follow the people who have enrolled and hope to follow more people in the future. But right now, our enrollment is done. Unless you want to come to Pittsburgh this weekend when we are enrolling people from Pittsburgh for the study.
And we have a comment from Jason Green. He is from the Fayetteville Works Commission. He's a wastewater treatment manager. He says, please advise your participants that it is your opinion not to drink tap water and is not based on established EPA regulations. Again, that comment is, please advise your participants that it is your opinion not to drink tap water and is not based on established EPA regulations.
Right, and I will say that these are people who have private wells, not that are served by municipal water at this point.
Does anyone have any additional questions or need clarification on a previously answered question? I'm going to come back to you, Mike.
And if you have your surveys, hand them to Katie.
The question I got, she said people should talk to you guys inside the city for possibly.
Yeah, this weekend.
There may be people that do want to contact you. You want me to have them call that number?
No, there's an enrollment. They can go to our they can go to our website and they can see if they're eligible. I think it says Pittsburgh, but if their wells have been tested, they meet our eligibility criteria.
Okay, I'll if you have no issues, I'll put that out to go to your site and look at it too. One of the things I'm really urging people, please do not sign up if you don't want to show up.
Thank you.
They waste research time and time.
So we hope to host more of these in the future and give you more information as we learn it. Thanks so much for joining us either in person or on Zoom. And if you have any questions, you can catch us before we go. And don't forget to give Katie back her survey. Great. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Dr. Hopkins from Drake Creek Resident United, representing the four counties, Sampson, Robertson, Wayne, and Sumner County. We want to thank you for all the research you are working with doing in Cumberland County, Wayne County.
Nadine.
Who differ who die after signing up. So this was a 2-week period. So maybe people died, but probably not 60%. Yeah, no, people, you never expect 100% of people to show up. And it's a hard time to do this research, but on the other hand, it's important to do the research now because we know that the levels are changing and we want to understand them before they've changed too much. Is there a question from Clara? Okay.
We were just getting entries, it looks like.
Okay.
And if you have any other additional questions that you think of following this meeting, you can always contact Sustainable Sandhills with the Mid-Basin point of contact. for the researchers in the study, and we'll be happy to relay those questions to the researchers at NC State. Sustainablefayetteville.org, contact us through our website, or 910-484-9098.
Also, our study website.
Yeah, and you can always reach out to us through our study website or email or give us a call. And we also try to update our frequently asked questions and resources on the website as well. All right, I'm turning off.
So that concludes the session.